Good morning, First Baptist Church family. I'm Dustin Erwin, a deacon at First Baptist Church, and this is my family. This is my wife Tricia, and these are our kids Gideon, Ava, Alden, and Charlotte. Even though we may not be at the church together worshiping today, let us be reminded that we are the church wherever we are. Welcome to worship.
Hey everyone, my name is Gavin Whitson. Today I'm going to be reading from Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. The walk to Emmaus. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, and about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, with whose name was Cleopas, answered him, Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead of us as if he were going in. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told us what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to worship. We're so glad you're with us today. I'm Preston Holly, Minister of Music here at First Baptist Church. Join us as we sing, "Open My Eyes That I May See."
Set me free.
us again as we sing, Walking Along with Jesus.
Henry Ward Beecher was a 19th century preacher from New York City who was probably best known for his opposition to slavery. But he was also an incredible preacher. And one time from the pulpit, he said this. He said, "It's unwise for us to judge a person by the peak of excellence in their life." He said, instead, we need to judge that person by the distance they've traveled from the place where they started from. So for Beecher, life was all about a journey. And he would suggest that that's how we should judge people, and probably even judge ourselves more, based upon how far we've gone in life. Jesus was constantly on a journey. That's why I mentioned that word, because he was, as Will Willimon says, he was peripatetic. He was always on the move. You notice in the Gospels during his 3-year public ministry, he didn't bed down anywhere for too long. He didn't put down roots in Nazareth. He was always going somewhere. So isn't it interesting? It's actually probably counterproductive that people like you and me, for example, disciples, people who claim to follow him, buy a house and put down roots. Because if we're going to be genuine disciples, if we're going to follow the one named Jesus Christ, then don't you think that we need to be on the move too? That as followers, we're always on this spiritual journey. So in Luke 24, Jesus is on his final journey before he ascends into heaven. He's walking to the village of Emmaus with 2 disciples, Cleopas and this unnamed disciple. So they're going to Emmaus, and we really don't know much about the village of Emmaus. The only thing that we're told in Scripture is it was about 7 miles outside of Jerusalem. But that's it. We don't know the significance of it. You probably heard of the name Frederick Buechner before. He's an incredible Christian writer. And he says that Emmaus is the place where you'd go if you wanted to get lost. So Cleopas and this unnamed disciple, they're heading to Emmaus, Buechner would say, to get lost. I mean, you think about all the emotional turmoil that these 2 experienced in the past couple of days. the trial, the death, the resurrection, supposedly. They're dealing with so much internally, and so they just need to get lost. And Emmaus is the place where they go to get lost. Do you have an Emmaus? Donald Miller wrote the book Blue Like Jazz. He's a very talented Christian writer, and one time in his life, he just felt like he needed to get lost. He was a leader of this Bible study group at a church outside of Houston. He was very successful, an incredible teacher, and everybody told him that. They said, Donald, you're just so good at this. You're so gifted. Maybe God is calling you to the preaching ministry. But one day, Donald just felt empty inside. And even though all of the church members had these words of affirmation for him, he just felt empty. And he felt like a phony. He wasn't the disciple that God was calling him to be. So he set an appointment with his preacher one day, and he said, look, I've got to get out of town. And the preacher said, well, let's talk about this. Let me counsel you some. And he said, no, I don't want you to counsel me. I just need to get lost. I need to find myself. And his pastor said, well, where do you plan on finding yourself? He goes, well, somewhere out west. He said, I don't know how long I'm going to be gone, but I'll be back eventually. So Donald got in his car and he headed out west and ended up at the Grand Canyon, where he slept under the stars and he spent his nights praying. And he said, God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for being a phony disciple. The Grand Canyon was his Emmaus. So where's your Emmaus? Do you have one? Is it a spiritual Emmaus? Maybe it's a physical Emmaus. But we all need a place where we can get lost, especially during these dark days of COVID-19. I find myself so stressed and so anxious all of the time. And I would give anything to just sit inside of a restaurant or worship with you in this beautiful sanctuary. I need to get lost. And so for me, I've gotten lost by walking the trails around Erwin, going up in the mountains. So the trails and hiking in the mountains have been my Emmaus. Do you have an Emmaus? Let's get back to the journey in chapter 24, Luke. So the disciples, Cleopas and the unknown disciple, they're walking with Jesus. They're on this journey, and we're told that their eyes were kept from seeing Jesus. That's how my translation says this, that they're unable to see Jesus. So this would mean that God kept them from seeing who Jesus really was, which poses so many questions. Why would God prevent them from seeing Christ in the flesh who's walking right beside them? Well, we'll get back to this eventually. So they're on their way to Emmaus, and they're talking about what had just happened to Jesus. They're talking about the death, the burial, and the supposed resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Jesus wants to know, of course, they don't know it's Jesus yet. He wants to know what they're talking about, and he says, "Tell what happened?" They said, "How did you not know what happened?" I mean, this was front page news in Jerusalem. So they proceed to tell him about what had happened. And they even add, we had hoped that this was going to be the one to redeem Israel. Well, little did they know that God in the person of Jesus Christ had already redeemed the world. Well, Jesus has had enough, and he says, y'all are just so foolish. And then he begins to open the scriptures to him, and he says, he speaks to the prophets, and he said, the prophets foretold of this Messiah, and yet all of Jesus' words fall on deaf ears. They just don't see God in the flesh standing before them. All the while, they're still on the way to Emmaus. Well, they finally get to the little village, and instead of going into town, Jesus decides to just keep on going. And they said, no, wait, come with us. Come with us to Emmaus. Now, the Greek here is really, really strong. they prevented Jesus from going on. It reads, at least in the Greek, that they almost accosted Jesus. I mean, they just physically wanted to prevent him from going on the road. And so, why would they do this? Well, you could say because they lived in a culture that valued hospitality, they're just being hospitable to this visitor. And that could be a reason. But I think because the Greek is so strong here, it's more than that. I think, and you can take this with a grain of salt, I am from Texas after all. But I think the reason why they accosted Jesus, the reason why they almost constrained Jesus from going on down the road, is because slowly but surely, as they were on this journey, their eyes were being opened to who Jesus really was. And they weren't ready to let him go yet. And so, finally, when they sit down across the table from Jesus and he breaks the bread, they're able to see. And they see that it's God in the flesh, and then he vanishes. And Luke describes it like this. He said their hearts were burning. I love the way John Wesley described, the founder of the Methodist movement, described his first encounter with Jesus Christ. He said his heart was strangely warmed. So Luke describes it in a similar way. That upon realizing that Jesus was in their midst, that their hearts were warmed. Remember that first encounter with Jesus? Would you say your heart was warmed? For Cleopas and this unnamed disciple, we're told their heart was warmed as they realized that it was Jesus sitting before them. So back to the bookmark that we placed earlier in the sermon. Why was it that God prevented them from seeing that it was indeed Jesus walking beside them on the journey? Why would God do such a thing? Here's what I think. I think that I want to go back to what Beecher said, where he said we should really judge someone based upon how far they've traveled from where they've started. I think slowly but surely their eyes were being opened, and right after they left Jerusalem for Emmaus, they weren't ready yet to see Jesus. They weren't spiritually ready, but they move from Jerusalem. They're spiritually blind, but the closer they get, their eyes are being opened to what God is doing in their midst, to God being right beside them on this journey. You know, sometimes you got to get lost. You got to go to Emmaus to be found. So many people think that after baptism, right after baptism, that we should have this spiritually robust life, and that's not how it works. We don't have everything figured out at baptism. It's a journey. The Christian life is this perpetual journey to Emmaus. But here's what happens in the process. We're headed to Emmaus. Maybe we want to just get lost. We want to leave it all behind. But what happens is, in the process of trying to get lost, that's where God finds us. That's where God is waiting for us. God's waiting for us in Emmaus. That's where you're going to find God. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. again. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Sermon Talkback session. I am privileged to be joined by Greg Petersmith, who attends First Baptist Church of Erwin. He has agreed to participate in this session via Zoom. So, Greg, let's talk about our text today from Luke 24. I talk about the spiritual life as a journey. So, journey as a metaphor for walking this way with Jesus Christ. Would you agree or disagree with that?
No, I wholeheartedly agree. I think that's a great metaphor. I think it kind of speaks to continuous improvement, continuously trying to get closer to God and Jesus Christ. Life is a journey, so it's a great metaphor. I like it.
So this walk to Emmaus, it was a physical journey, 7 miles from Jerusalem, not a long journey, but it also was a spiritual pilgrimage. And I contend that when these two disciples leave Jerusalem for Emmaus, they're spiritually blind. God prevents them from seeing. But then once they get to Emmaus and they break bread together, they're able to see. And so they move from spiritual blindness to sight. Isn't this how life goes with Jesus? I mean, we start blind, and then as we go along, our eyes are open more and more.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the funny thing is, you mentioned that. I think when I was younger, I can speak to this personally, and this applies to just about every person 20 years and younger feels that their eyes are open. They think they understand everything and know everything, and of course they don't. And as we all get older, we realize, older and wiser, then I think people realize, okay, now my eyes really are open, and I do understand some of these concepts that we thought we fully understood before, but maybe didn't. So that's really interesting you bring that up.
I think some people think that at baptism we're supposed to be spiritually mature and have it all figured out. Yeah. And usually, that's the beginning of our journey. And so we figure out the longer we follow Jesus is how maybe little we know. And so you're constantly learning and gaining information and becoming more in his likeness.
Yeah, and I think staying humble is a big part of that. So
that's right. It does require humility.
Yeah.
So Frederick Buechner, I mentioned Frederick Buechner, and he says that Emmaus is a place where you go to get lost. And so the two disciples had just endured all of this emotional turmoil from the trial and crucifixion. And so they go to Emmaus to leave it all behind. And I talk about in the sermon, I think how important it is that we all have an Emmaus, because it allows us to get lost and kind of leave everything behind. It's a time of Sabbath to be refueled. Do you have an Emmaus? And if so, will you tell us?
I was wondering if you were going to ask me that. I sort of have a physical one here in the house. I've sort of claimed the basement as my own, so I've got my workshop and electronics bench and that sort of thing down there. But really, I'm pretty well practiced at. I can kind of get lost in my own head, my own thoughts. So that's a good getaway for me. Before I fall asleep at night, I might lay in bed and just kind of think about things and think about the day and maybe things I did wrong, things I did right. That tends to be when I really, if I'm going to pray really hard and really focus, that's when I do it. So I can get lost in my own head. I don't think I really need to physically necessarily go anywhere. I think most people generally do. I think a physical separation from others tends to help. I can do it in my own head, so that's kind of nice. It's convenient.
I think now during this COVID-19 crisis more than ever, we need that getaway. Mm-hmm. Because often, even though we're surrounded by those we love, we're with someone 24/7, and so we need that time, that space, just to get away.
Agree
to
completely.
experience some renewal.
Yeah.
What about a spiritual Emmaus? Can you speak to that, or maybe as you travel, as you're apart in that physical Emmaus, you can be refreshed spiritually. So
Yeah, I think, I mentioned getting away in my own head, and I think I do tend to refresh and renew in that way. Um, I don't need a physical pilgrimage somewhere, I don't think, for myself, and I'm definitely not speaking for others. But getting inside my own head and kind of clearing my thoughts, deciding and thinking about what's really important, and kind of reprioritizing things. That's pretty important to me, and I think that's where the spiritual component really comes into play.
I mentioned at the end of the sermon that sometimes you have to get lost in order to be found.
Yeah.
And so these two travelers head to Emmaus trying to get lost, get rid of everything, and yet that's where they find the presence of Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would you say that has been true in your own life? Sometimes you need to be lost in order to get found.
It absolutely has been. I think that's a really human thing, that we almost need to be broken before we can be fixed.
That's right.
I know there's some people that can go through life and continuously tweak and improve themselves. I've never been that way. Something needs to almost give before I realize, okay, there's a problem. Let's work on this. So yeah, you're absolutely right. You do need to be. Most people, I would say, need to be lost before found.
And just for an example, the concept of grace. In order to give grace, you had to receive grace. And so, to me, to really know what it feels like to experience the grace that God gives, you have to mess up first.
That's right.
You have to realize you're broken before you can be fixed, as you said.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining us today for this talk back. I really appreciate it.
Kobe, thanks for having me. This was great. Appreciate it.
If you would, please join me in speaking our benediction. Christ with you, before you, and behind you. Christ in you, beneath you, and above you. Christ on your right and on your left. Christ when you lie down. Christ when you sit down. Christ when you arise. Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of you. Christ on the tongue of all who speak of you. Christ in every eye that sees you. Christ in every ear that hears you.